August 9, 1936. Berlin Olympic Stadium. Coach Charles Robertson watched Jesse Owens dominate Hitler's Aryan athletes all week. That's exactly why the SS planned to poison him at the victory reception. Robertson noticed the waiter's trembling hands first, then the way he avoided eye contact when serving Jesse's champagne. A veteran of the Great War, Robertson had seen enough killers to recognize one. He knocked the glass from Jesse's hand 3 seconds before it touched his lips. What happened in the next 10 minutes changed both their lives forever. The SS dragged Robertson into a back room. Jesse vanished into the crowd. And somewhere in that chaos, Robertson's camera captured something the Reich would kill to keep hidden. 30 years later, they finally came for him. The night coach Robertson learned some victories cost more than losing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. Dutch Morrison's hand trembled as he reached for Jesse Owens across the marble floor of the Kaiserhof Hotel ballroom. The poison ring felt like molten lead against his palm. A simple twist of the band, a scratch during their handshake, and the most celebrated athlete in the world would collapse within minutes. "Congratulations on your victories," Dutch managed, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. Jesse's eyes held his, unflinching. There was something there, a flicker of understanding that made Dutch's blood freeze. "Coach Morrison," Jesse replied quietly, extending his own hand. "I was hoping we'd have a chance to talk." The words hit Dutch like a physical blow. Jesse knew. But how much? Around them, the Nazi elite mingled beneath crystal chandeliers, their laughter echoing off marble columns draped with swastikas. Hitler himself stood 20 feet away, holding court with his inner circle, occasionally glancing toward Jesse with barely concealed contempt. The Führer expected a show, a dramatic collapse of the man who had embarrassed the Reich before the world. Dutch's fingers found the ring's mechanism. One twist, one scratch. Tommy would be safe. Jesse leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Your boy's in the basement of the Bavarian State Library. 3rd sublevel. They moved him an hour ago." The world tilted. "What did you say?" "The photograph they showed you was taken yesterday, but he's not there anymore." Jesse's grip tightened on Dutch's hand, preventing him from pulling away. "Someone's been feeding you information, Coach. The question is why?" Dutch's mind reeled. The SS officer, Oberfuhrer Klaus Richter, had been crystal clear. Kill Jesse Owens, get Tommy back, fail and watch his son die. But if Jesse knew where Tommy was, if the boy had already been moved, "This is a trap," Dutch breathed. "For both of us." Jesse's eyes flicked toward the ballroom's main entrance, where several SS officers had positioned themselves. "They don't just want me dead, Coach. They want it to look like an American conspiracy. You kill me, they kill you as the assassin, and suddenly the United States is responsible for murdering their own athlete on German soil." The poison ring felt suddenly worthless in Dutch's palm. He'd been played from the beginning. Tommy's kidnapping, the recruitment, the careful positioning as Jesse's escort for the evening, all of it orchestrated to create the perfect political assassination. "Where's my son?" Dutch's voice cracked. "Safe. For now." Jesse's smile was grim. "But we've got about 2 minutes before they realize their plan isn't working." Dutch scanned the room with new eyes. The SS officers weren't just guarding the exits. They were positioned to contain the scene, to control the narrative. In the corner, he spotted a man with a camera, pretending to document the festivities, but actually waiting for the perfect shot of Jesse's collapse. "What do you want me to do?" Jesse's grip shifted, and suddenly Dutch felt something small and hard pressed into his palm alongside the poison ring. A key. "Service elevator, North Corridor. It leads to the kitchen loading dock. My people are waiting." "Your people?" "Let's just say not everyone in Berlin supports the home team." Jesse's voice carried the weight of secrets Dutch couldn't begin to fathom. "But first, we need to give them a show." Before Dutch could ask what he meant, Jesse stumbled backward, his hand flying to his throat. His performance was flawless. The sudden gasping, the look of betrayal as he stared at Dutch, the dramatic collapse to one knee. The ballroom erupted. Shouts in German filled the air as guests pressed forward. Dutch stood frozen, watching Jesse writhe on the marble floor, understanding with crystal clarity that everything had just changed. Richter appeared at his elbow, his face a mask of satisfaction. "Excellent work, Herr Morrison. The Reich appreciates your loyalty." But as the SS officer raised his hand undoubtedly to signal Dutch's own elimination, 3 sharp cracks echoed through the ballroom. Not gunshots, something else. The massive chandeliers above began to sway, their chains snapping one by one. Chaos. Screaming guests dove for cover as crystal and metal crashed down onto the marble floor. In the confusion, Dutch saw Jesse roll behind an overturned table, very much alive and moving with the fluid grace of an Olympic sprinter. The lights went out. In the darkness, Dutch felt a hand grab his arm. "Move," Jesse's voice commanded. "Now." They ran through the blackness, navigating by memory and desperation. Behind them, flashlight beams cut through the dark as SS officers shouted orders. Dutch's dress shoes slipped on the polished floors as they reached the service corridor. The elevator was waiting, doors open. As they stumbled inside, Dutch caught a glimpse of their rescuer, a young woman in a server's uniform, her face hard with determination. "Status?" she asked Jesse in accented English. "3 down," Jesse replied as the elevator descended. "Morrison's clean." Dutch pressed his back against the elevator wall, his heart hammering against his ribs. 3 down? What does that mean? Jesse looked at him with something that might have been pity. "The athletes who were supposed to die tonight instead of me, coach. The ones who actually believed they were here for a celebration." The elevator shuddered to a stop, and Dutch realized that whatever he'd thought he understood about this night had been completely wrong. The elevator doors opened onto a loading dock shrouded in December fog. Dutch's legs nearly buckled as the cold Berlin air hit his face, mixing sweat with the acrid smell of coal smoke from the city's chimneys. The young woman in the server's uniform, he still didn't know her name, gestured them toward a waiting truck, its engine already running. "Get in the back," she commanded, her accent thick but her English precise. "We have maybe 10 minutes before they reorganize." Dutch climbed into the truck bed, his dress clothes completely inadequate for the bitter cold. Jesse slid in beside him, and Dutch noticed for the first time that the Olympic champion's hands were shaking, not from cold, but from something deeper. Fear, maybe. Or exhaustion from carrying secrets too heavy for any 23-year-old to bear. "Tommy," Dutch whispered as the truck lurched into motion. "My son. You said he was safe." Jesse pulled a woolen blanket from somewhere in the darkness and wrapped it around both their shoulders. The gesture was oddly intimate. 2 men huddled together against the night and against forces neither fully understood. "He's with friends of mine, Americans who've been watching this whole operation unfold." "What operation?" Dutch's voice cracked. "I don't understand any of this. 3 hours ago I was just a track coach from Ohio. Now you're telling me there are dead athletes, and my son—" The words choked off in his throat. The truck hit a pothole, throwing them against the metal sidewall. Jesse steadied himself and studied Dutch's face in the dim light filtering through the canvas cover. "You really don't know, do you? They picked you completely clean. Know what? The athletes who died tonight. Ralph Metcalf's training partner, Harold Abrahams's protege from Cambridge, a French sprinter named Marcel Dubois. They weren't random targets." Jesse's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "They were all asking questions about the games, about timing irregularities, about performance data that didn't match what they witnessed on the track." Dutch felt something cold settle in his stomach. Performance data? Times that were adjusted, records that were enhanced. The Reich needed their Olympic narrative to be perfect, coach. They couldn't have inconvenient witnesses. The truck slowed, then turned onto what felt like cobblestones. Through a gap in the canvas, Dutch caught a glimpse of narrow medieval streets, the kind that had survived centuries of wars and would likely survive whatever was coming next. The normalcy of it, laundry hanging from windows, the warm glow of kitchen lights, a cat picking its way carefully across wet stones, made everything else feel like a fever dream. "Your son," Jesse continued, "he wasn't taken randomly either. Someone's been watching you, coach. Someone who knew you'd do anything to protect that boy." Dutch thought of Tommy's laugh, the way the 12-year-old's face lit up when he talked about track and field, how he'd begged to come to Berlin to watch the Olympics. Dutch had said no, thank God. He'd said the trip would be too expensive, too complicated. But really, he'd been afraid of what he might see in Germany, afraid of the stories he'd been hearing from Jewish colleagues who had family in Europe. "How do you know about my son?" Dutch asked. Jesse was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of choices made and prices paid. "Because I've been watching you too, Coach. Ever since you started asking questions about the qualifying times." The truck stopped. Dutch heard voices outside, German voices, but relaxed, conversational. Normal people going about their evening business, unaware that the carefully orchestrated world of the 1936 Olympics was cracking apart just blocks away. "I never asked questions about qualifying times," Dutch said slowly. "You did. 3 months ago, you wrote a letter to the U.S. Olympic Committee about discrepancies you'd noticed in the preliminary heat results, about how certain German athletes seemed to be posting times that didn't match what coaches from other nations had recorded." Dutch's memory stirred. He had written that letter, but it had seemed so insignificant at the time. Just a coach's natural curiosity about competition data. "You're telling me that letter made you a liability?" Jesse shifted under the blanket, and Dutch caught a glimpse of something metallic tucked into his waistband and made Tommy leverage. The truck's engine cut off. In the sudden silence, Dutch could hear his own heartbeat and the distant sound of church bells marking the hour. 9 o'clock. 3 hours since this nightmare began, and already everything he thought he knew about the world had been turned upside down. "What happens now?" he whispered. Jesse looked at him with those dark eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. "Now we get your son back, and then we decide whether we're going to let them bury the truth about what really happened at these games." The canvas flap opened, and cold air rushed in, carrying with it the sound of footsteps and the promise that this night was far from over. The reckoning. The face that appeared in the truck's opening belonged to neither friend nor foe, but something far worse, a ghost from Dutch's past that he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. Heinrich Schultz stepped into the pale circle of streetlight. Older now, but unmistakably the same man who had recruited Dutch Morrison in 1913, when the world was different and young Americans still believed in the nobility of international competition. "Hello, Arthur," Heinrich said in that familiar, cultured voice. "It's been a long time." Dutch felt the blood drain from his face. Jesse tensed beside him, his hand moving toward whatever weapon he'd concealed. But Dutch couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process anything beyond the impossible reality of Heinrich standing there in a Berlin street, wearing the uniform of an SS Oberfuhrer. "You know him," Jesse said. "It wasn't a question." "I trained him," Heinrich answered before Dutch could respond. "In preparation and technique, in the art of getting close to a target." His pale eyes fixed on Dutch with something that might have been paternal disappointment. "Though clearly my instruction was inadequate," Dutch's voice came out as a croak. "You're supposed to be dead." A useful fiction. Heinrich stepped closer to the truck, and Dutch saw that he wasn't alone. 3 other SS officers flanked him, their weapons drawn but not yet aimed. The Great War provided excellent cover for many necessary deaths and rebirths. The Reich has long memories, Arthur, and longer patience. Jesse's breath hissed between his teeth. "Reich? You've been working with them since before—" "Since before there was a Reich," Heinrich confirmed. "Since before there was a Nazi party. Since before any of you understood what was really at stake." He smiled, and the expression transformed his aristocratic features into something predatory. "Tell me, Arthur, did you really think tonight was about killing one remarkable Negro athlete? Did you imagine this was about German racial superiority or political theater?" Dutch's mind reeled backward 23 years, to a cramped hotel room in Stockholm, where a younger Heinrich had first approached him. Back then, Heinrich had claimed to represent an international coalition of athletic officials concerned about fairness in competition. He'd spoken passionately about the corrupting influence of nationalism in sport, about the need for objective observers who could ensure that the fastest, strongest, most skilled athletes won regardless of their country's political influence. "The Stockholm Games," Dutch whispered. "You weren't there for international fairness. I was there for you, Arthur. Young, idealistic, brilliant at reading the tactical aspects of competition. You had everything we needed: the ability to see patterns, to predict outcomes, to identify threats to our interests. Heinrich's voice carried genuine warmth, as if he were reminiscing about a favorite student. And most importantly, you had the moral flexibility to act on that information. Jesse shifted, and Dutch heard the soft click of a weapon being readied. What threats? What interests? Heinrich's attention turned to Jesse with cool appraisal. The same ones that brought you here tonight, Mr. Owens, though I suspect you understand the real scope of this better than our friend Arthur does. You're talking about the times, Jesse said flatly. The performance data, the records. I'm talking about control. Heinrich stepped back slightly, and his officers raised their weapons. For centuries, athletic competition has been one of humanity's purest expressions. The fastest runner, the strongest fighter, the most skilled competitor. These things couldn't be faked or manipulated. They provided an objective measure of human potential that transcended politics, economics, even war. Dutch felt something cold and terrible settling in his chest. Until you found a way to fake them. Until we found a way to optimize them. Heinrich's correction was gentle but firm. Chemical enhancement, surgical modification, genetic selection, all techniques that were primitive in 1913 but have evolved considerably. The question facing us was whether to allow these developments to proceed chaotically, with each nation pursuing its own advantages, or to manage them centrally for the greater good. Jesse's voice was barely controlled. Greater good according to who? According to those with the wisdom and resources to see beyond national boundaries. Heinrich gestured to the medieval street around them, to the ancient buildings that had witnessed empires rise and fall. Governments change, Mr. Owens. Ideologies come and go. But excellence endures if it's properly cultivated. Dutch's throat felt like sandpaper. Tommy, where's my son? Heinrich reached into his coat and withdrew a photograph. Even in the dim light, Dutch could see that it showed Tommy sitting at a desk in what appeared to be a classroom or laboratory. The boy looked healthy but confused, surrounded by men in white coats who were studying him with clinical interest. Your son has exceptional potential, Heinrich said. His genetic markers suggest he could surpass even Mr. Owens's achievements with the proper guidance. We've been monitoring the Morrison family line for some time. The photograph fluttered from Dutch's numb fingers. Everything, the coaching position, the invitation to Berlin, even meeting Heinrich in Stockholm 23 years ago, all of it had been orchestrated. His entire life had been a carefully constructed path leading to this moment. You never wanted me to kill Jesse, Dutch said, the truth hitting him like a physical blow. You wanted me to save him. Heinrich smiled. Welcome to your real assignment, Arthur. The words hung in the frigid air like a death sentence. Dutch stared at Heinrich's smile, the same patient professorial expression he'd worn in Stockholm when explaining the noble work they would do together. But now Dutch understood what that smile really meant. He'd been a puppet for 23 years, dancing to strings he'd never even seen. I don't understand, Dutch whispered, though part of him was beginning to. You will. Heinrich folded his hands behind his back, the gesture almost scholarly. Tell me, Arthur, what do you think happens when Jesse Owens returns to America tomorrow? When the world's fastest man speaks to reporters about German hospitality, about the excellence of Reich organization? Jesse's intake of breath was sharp beside him. Dutch saw understanding dawn in the athlete's eyes, the same terrible comprehension that was crawling up Dutch's spine like ice water. You want him as a spokesperson, Jesse said, a living advertisement. I want him alive, Heinrich corrected, healthy, grateful, and indebted. His gaze shifted to Dutch. You see, Arthur, a dead martyr inspires resistance. But a living champion who owes his life to our intervention, who understands that his family, his friends, his future opportunities all depend on our continued goodwill. That man becomes invaluable. Dutch's hands were shaking. He tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. The poison ring felt like molten lead in his palm. The other athletes tonight, Jesse pressed, the ones who died, they wouldn't cooperate? They asked inconvenient questions. Heinrich's voice carried no more emotion than if he were discussing the weather. About timing discrepancies, yes, but more importantly about other athletes who had asked similar questions and subsequently withdrawn from competition. They were beginning to see patterns. What patterns? Dutch finally managed. Heinrich studied him for a long moment, then nodded to one of his officers. The man stepped forward and handed Dutch a manila folder. Even in the dim street light, Dutch could see it contained photographs and documents. "Open it," Heinrich suggested. Dutch's fingers fumbled with the folder. Inside were pictures of athletes he recognized, some from the current games, others from competitions going back years. Each photograph was marked with notes in precise German handwriting, performance metrics, training regimens, and in several cases, red stamps that Dutch couldn't read but somehow knew meant termination. "We've been refining our approach for decades," Heinrich explained, "identifying the most promising athletes, understanding their psychological profiles, their vulnerabilities. Some respond to financial incentives, others to threats against loved ones. A few require more permanent solutions." Dutch's vision blurred. Among the photographs was one of Tommy at a track meet last spring, mid-stride, his face bright with joy. Someone had written notes about the boy's form, his potential, his genetic inheritance from his father. At the bottom, a question mark in red ink. "You sick bastards," Dutch breathed. "We're architects of the future." Heinrich's voice hardened slightly. "In 10 years, 20, 50, the athletes who dominate international competition will be our creations, enhanced, optimized, controlled. The primitive nationalism that currently drives sport will give way to a more unified approach." Jesse shifted in the truck bed, and Dutch sensed he was preparing to move. But Heinrich's officers had spread out, covering all angles. Even Jesse Owens couldn't outrun bullets. "What do you want from me?" Dutch asked. "Exactly what you've already done. You saved Jesse's life tonight, in full view of witnesses. You're a hero, Arthur, an American coach who risked everything to protect a Negro athlete from Nazi assassins." Heinrich's smile returned. "The story will play beautifully in the international press, and Jesse will confirm every detail. Won't you, Mr. Owens?" Jesse's silence stretched too long. Dutch could feel the tension radiating from the young man's body, the desperate calculation of odds and options. "My family," Jesse finally said, "will be as safe as Tommy Morrison, as long as you both understand your roles." Heinrich reached into his coat again and withdrew 2 train tickets. "Tomorrow's express to Paris, then a ship to New York. You'll travel together, the heroic coach and the grateful athlete. By the time you reach America, the story will already be established." Dutch stared at the tickets. His name was printed on one in crisp black letters. Below it, a seat assignment. Below that, in smaller text, "Property of Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda." "And if we refuse?" Dutch asked. Heinrich didn't answer directly. Instead, he nodded to the officer holding the photographs. The man produced 2 more images, Tommy Morrison and a young woman Dutch didn't recognize but whom Jesse clearly did, judging by the sharp intake of breath. "Choose carefully," Heinrich said. "Your next words will determine whether this conversation ends with handshakes or with tragedy." The church bells chimed again. 9:30. Dutch realized he was no longer trying to save anyone. He was simply trying to determine the least terrible way to surrender. Dutch looked at the train tickets, then at the photographs of Tommy and Jesse's sister, girlfriend. The young woman's face was gentle, trusting, completely unaware that her image was being used as leverage in a Berlin street at 9:30 on the most twisted night of Dutch's life. "Ruth," Jesse said quietly, confirming Dutch's guess. "Her name is Ruth." Heinrich nodded approvingly. "A lovely girl. Currently staying with friends in Cleveland, I believe. She works at a library, dreams of becoming a teacher. Very admirable aspirations." The casual intimacy of Heinrich's knowledge hit Dutch like a physical blow. How long had they been watching? How many lives had they catalogued, cross-referenced, prepared for manipulation? He thought of his own Ruth, Tommy's mother, dead these 5 years from influenza, and wondered if Heinrich's organization had files on her too, if her death had been natural or convenient. "You're insane," Dutch whispered. "All of you. This entire operation." "We're inevitable," Heinrich corrected. Sport is becoming too valuable to leave uncontrolled. Television will change everything within a generation. Millions of people watching simultaneously, nations rising and falling based on their athletes' performances. Did you really think we'd allow that kind of influence to remain random? Jesse's hand tightened around his concealed weapon. People aren't machines. You can't just optimize human beings. Can't we? Heinrich gestured to one of his officers, who stepped forward and handed him another folder. Mr. Owens, your personal best in the 100 meters before this year was 10.3 seconds. Yet somehow, in the span of 6 months, you've shaved 2/10 off that time. Remarkable improvement. Dutch saw Jesse's face go pale. That's training. Better technique. Perhaps. Heinrich opened the folder, revealing medical charts and chemical formulas that made Dutch's head spin. Or perhaps it's the vitamin supplements your coach has been providing. Enhanced calcium for bone density, modified B-complex for nerve conductivity, completely legal, completely undetectable, and completely effective. The world tilted sideways. Dutch grabbed the truck's sidewall for support as the implication hit him. You're saying I've been administering performance enhancers to your athletes for 3 years, Heinrich confirmed. The supplements were delivered through official Olympic Committee channels. You never questioned their authenticity because you never suspected their true nature. Jesse was staring at Dutch with growing horror. The vitamins, the ones you said would help with altitude adjustment. Dutch's mind raced backward through dozens of training sessions, hundreds of pills and powders he'd distributed without question. The steady improvement in his athletes' times, the way Jesse had seemed almost superhuman in recent competitions, even the poison ring. Had that been enhanced too? Was he carrying some sophisticated chemical weapon without realizing it? Every American athlete under your supervision has been part of the program, Heinrich continued. The Reich's chemists needed test subjects for their work. Your coaching position made you the perfect unwitting distributor. You made me into— Dutch couldn't finish the sentence. Into a pioneer. The first of a new generation of coaches who will help us reshape human athletic potential. Heinrich's voice carried genuine pride. Your success rate has been remarkable. 93% performance improvement across your entire roster. Dutch thought he was going to vomit. 3 years of believing in his athletes' natural talent, their hard work and dedication. 3 years of taking credit for training methods that were actually chemical manipulation. How many other coaches were unknowing participants in this program? How many athletes thought their achievements were earned through sweat and determination when they were really products of Heinrich's laboratory? The other coaches who died tonight, Jesse said slowly. They found out. They became suspicious when their own athletes began asking questions. Why were the Americans improving so dramatically? Why did certain compounds in the official supplements produce unusual test results when analyzed independently? Heinrich shrugged. We couldn't risk exposure before the program reached maturity. Dutch felt something break inside him, not just his understanding of the world, but his understanding of himself. Every moment of pride he'd felt watching his athletes succeed, every speech he'd given about the triumph of human spirit over physical limitation, all of it had been a lie built on chemical enhancement and manipulation. Tommy, he said, his voice barely audible. The genetic markers you mentioned, you're planning to offer him opportunities his father never had. Chemical optimization from adolescence rather than adulthood produces far superior results. Heinrich smiled at Dutch's expression. Consider it a promotion, Arthur, from unwitting participant to full partner. The church bells chimed 10 o'clock. In the distance, Dutch could hear the sounds of Berlin's nightlife continuing, people laughing, music playing, the ordinary business of human existence carrying on while his world collapsed around him. He looked at Jesse, seeing his own horror reflected in the young man's eyes. They weren't victims of Heinrich's program. They were products of it. And now they had to decide whether to keep being products or become something else entirely, even if it killed them. The church bells fell silent, leaving only the sound of Dutch's ragged breathing in the cold Berlin air. He stared at Heinrich's expectant face, at Jesse's horrified expression, at the photographs of Tommy and Ruth scattered between them like evidence of lives already destroyed. The poison ring burned in his palm, another tool he'd carried without understanding, another lie in a lifetime built on deception. Full partner, Dutch repeated slowly. The words tasted like ashes. You want me to keep drugging children, my own son. I want you to accept reality. Heinrich's patience seemed infinite, professorial. The supplements will continue regardless of your cooperation, Arthur. The only question is whether you'll help us refine the process or watch from the sidelines as others take credit for your work. Jesse shifted beside him, and Dutch caught the subtle movement of his hand toward the concealed weapon. But something in Heinrich's stance suggested he was expecting, even hoping for, that kind of resistance. Dutch had seen that look before, in Stockholm, when Heinrich had maneuvered him into making what seemed like his own choice to join the program. Wait, Dutch said quietly, and Jesse's hand stilled. Heinrich's smile widened slightly. Good. You're beginning to understand the scope of what we've accomplished, what we could accomplish together. But Dutch wasn't looking at Heinrich anymore. He was looking at the photographs scattered in the truck bed, at the meticulous German notes, at the red stamps marking terminated subjects. Something about the handwriting nagged at him, the precise loops, the careful spacing. He'd seen it before, but not in any official document. Show me Tommy's file again, Dutch said. Heinrich seemed pleased by the request. He gestured to his officer, who handed Dutch a thicker folder. Inside were detailed psychological assessments, genetic projections, training recommendations, page after page of clinical analysis, treating his son like a laboratory specimen, and there, at the bottom of the final page, was a signature Dutch recognized. His own. The folder slipped from nerveless fingers. That's impossible. Is it? Heinrich's voice carried gentle amusement. You've been filing reports on Tommy's development for 18 months, Arthur. Every training session, every competitive event, every sign of improvement or limitation. Quite thorough documentation. Dutch's mind reeled backward through seemingly innocent conversations. Heinrich asking about Tommy's progress at school. Casual questions about the boy's athletic interests. Requests for informal assessments that could help identify promising young athletes for the program. You told me those reports were for scholarship evaluations, Dutch whispered. They were, just not the kind of scholarship you imagined. Heinrich retrieved the scattered papers with careful precision. Tommy's potential is extraordinary, but it requires proper cultivation. The genetic advantages inherited from his father, combined with optimization techniques we've developed since your own treatment began. My own what? The words came out as a croak. Heinrich paused, studying Dutch's face with clinical interest. Surely you realized? The supplements weren't only for your athletes, Arthur. How else did you think a 45-year-old former coach developed the reflexes and endurance necessary for this evening's work? The ground seemed to shift beneath Dutch's feet. Every moment of pride in his own physical conditioning. Every time he'd kept pace with athletes half his age during training runs. Every split-second decision that had felt like instinct but might have been chemically enhanced reaction time. The ring, Dutch said, looking down at the poison device. You gave me enhanced reflexes so I could use it effectively. Among other modifications. Heinrich's tone suggested he was discussing routine maintenance rather than human experimentation. Improved hand-eye coordination, accelerated decision-making, enhanced stress tolerance. Nothing dramatic enough to raise suspicion, but sufficient to ensure success in high-pressure situations. Jesse was staring at Dutch with dawning comprehension. How long? How long have you been taking their drugs? I don't know, Dutch admitted. The shame burned worse than the cold. Years, maybe. I thought I was just staying healthy, keeping up with younger athletes. Heinrich said the vitamins were standard supplements for coaches working international competitions. Standard supplements that happen to include experimental performance enhancers, Heinrich confirmed. Your body has been our testing ground for techniques we're now ready to implement on a larger scale. Tommy represents the next phase, optimization from childhood rather than adaptation of adult physiology. Dutch closed his eyes, trying to separate his own thoughts from whatever chemical influences might be shaping them. Was his horror at Heinrich's revelation genuine, or the product of programmed responses? Was his love for Tommy real or manufactured to ensure cooperation? How much of his identity belonged to Arthur Morrison, and how much to Heinrich's carefully constructed puppet? When he opened his eyes, Jesse was watching him with something that might have been compassion. The question now, Heinrich continued, is whether you're ready to embrace your true nature, or whether you'll continue clinging to illusions of moral superiority that serve no one. Dutch looked at his hands, enhanced, optimized, no longer entirely his own. Then he looked at Heinrich's confident smile, the expression of a man who believed he understood every variable in his equation. You're wrong about one thing, Dutch said quietly. Heinrich raised an eyebrow. Oh? You think you own us because you changed our bodies. Dutch's voice grew stronger, but you never touched what makes us human. For the first time that evening, Heinrich's certainty flickered. Heinrich's momentary uncertainty vanished like smoke, replaced by something colder and more calculating. Humanity, he said, testing the word like a foreign phrase. An interesting theory, Arthur. Shall we examine it? He nodded to one of his officers, who produced a small leather case from his coat. Heinrich opened it with ceremonial precision, revealing a row of glass vials filled with clear liquid. Adrenaline suppressors, he explained conversationally. One injection, and the chemical enhancement coursing through your system becomes inert. Your reflexes return to those of a 68-year-old man. Your decision-making slows to normal human speed. Dutch felt Jesse tense beside him, both of them recognizing the trap being constructed. Your choice becomes beautifully simple, Heinrich continued. Remain enhanced and accept your role in Tommy's optimization, or return to your natural state and watch helplessly as we proceed without you. He lifted one of the vials, holding it up to catch the streetlight. Of course, at your age, the sudden withdrawal of compounds your system has grown dependent upon might prove traumatic. But that would be your decision. The church bells chimed again, 10:15. Dutch found himself calculating how much time had passed since the evening began, wondering if enhanced mental processing was helping him think more clearly or simply helping him rationalize faster. Every thought felt suspect now, every emotion potentially artificial. You're bluffing, Jesse said. If you kill him, you lose your leverage over Tommy. Heinrich's smile returned. Do I? Consider the narrative, Mr. Owens. Heroic grandfather dies defending his enhanced legacy. Grieving grandson accepts guidance from the organization that promises to honor that legacy. Children are remarkably adaptable to new circumstances. Dutch thought of Tommy's face the last time they'd spoken, bright with enthusiasm about his upcoming trials, trusting in his grandfather's guidance about training and nutrition. The boy had been consuming Heinrich supplements for months without knowing it, his body already changing in ways Dutch was only beginning to understand. The other athletes who died tonight, Dutch said slowly, they chose withdrawal. They chose poorly, Heinrich confirmed, but their deaths served a purpose. Each termination reinforced the program's security while providing valuable data about the psychological breaking points of enhanced subjects. Jesse's hand moved again toward his weapon, and this time Dutch didn't stop him. Whatever chemicals were influencing his judgment, they couldn't override the fundamental revulsion he felt at Heinrich's casual discussion of murder. You're talking about human beings, you sick bastard, not laboratory rats. The distinction becomes less meaningful with each generation, Heinrich replied. Your grandson's children will be optimized from birth. Their children will view unenhanced humans the way you might view primitive ancestors. Evolution guided by intelligence rather than chance. The vials caught the light again as Heinrich's grip shifted slightly. Dutch realized the man was preparing for violence, expecting it even. The entire conversation had been choreographed to reach this moment, the point where enhanced subjects faced their true nature and either embraced it or died fighting it. You made one mistake, Dutch said, his voice carrying a strength that surprised him. Heinrich paused, genuinely curious. Only one? You assumed the enhancements would make us more like you. Dutch felt Jesse shift beside him, ready to move on his signal. But they just made us better at being ourselves. The officer holding the photograph stepped closer, his hand moving toward his sidearm. The other two spread out wider, cutting off potential escape routes. Heinrich's theatrical confidence remained intact, but Dutch could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight tightening around his eyes. "Last chance, Arthur," Heinrich said softly. "Partnership or termination. Choose quickly." Dutch looked at the train tickets scattered in the truck bed, at the photographs of Tommy and Ruth, at Jesse's coiled readiness. The poison ring burned against his palm. Heinrich's tool turned against Heinrich's plans. 3 years of unknowing collaboration had led to this moment, this choice between becoming a willing monster or dying a complicated man. "I've made my choice," Dutch said, and pulled the pin from the ring with his teeth. Heinrich's eyes widened as Dutch bit down hard, not on the poison, on his own tongue, hard enough to draw blood that would trigger the ring's chemical sensors. The device began to hiss softly, releasing its contents into the air between them. "Run," Dutch gasped to Jesse, tasting copper and betrayal and something that might have been redemption. Jesse moved like lightning but not away, toward the nearest officer, his concealed weapon finally appearing in his hand. The man went down hard, his pistol skittering across the cobblestones. Heinrich stumbled backward, one hand pressed to his mouth and nose, his careful composure finally cracking. "You don't understand," he wheezed. "Without the program, Tommy dies anyway. The enhancement process, it's irreversible." Dutch felt his enhanced reflexes already beginning to fade as the ring's poison worked its way into his system. His last coherent thought was that Heinrich might be lying, or he might not be. Either way, Tommy would have to find his own path now. The poison cloud spread like spilled ink in the cold Berlin air, and Dutch felt the first wave of chemical withdrawal hit his nervous system like a sledgehammer. His enhanced reflexes stuttered, his artificially sharpened vision blurred, but his resolve crystallized into something harder than any compound Heinrich had ever devised. Jesse's tackle sent the second officer sprawling, but the man's weapon discharged, the shot echoing off the church walls like a thunderclap. Heinrich staggered further back, his face contorting as the ring's contents burned through his respiratory system, but his eyes remained fixed on Dutch with something between fury and professional admiration. "You think this changes anything?" Heinrich gasped, pulling a small radio from his coat. "Tommy's already in the system. The process begins with or without your cooperation." Dutch lurched forward, his legs already unsteady as the chemicals that had sustained him for 3 years began their violent exodus from his bloodstream. But 30 years of real coaching, of genuine human connection, drove him past the pain. He grabbed Heinrich's wrist before the radio reached his lips, squeezing until bones ground together. "Tell me how to reverse it," Dutch snarled, tasting blood and growing weakness. Heinrich's laugh turned into a coughing fit that sprayed crimson across the scattered photographs. Reverse evolution? Stop the future? His eyes were streaming now, but his voice carried terrible certainty. Tommy took his first optimized supplement 6 months ago. His cellular structure is already changing. "You can't turn back time, Arthur." The third officer raised his weapon toward Jesse, but Dutch's fading enhanced peripheral vision caught the movement. He released Heinrich and threw himself sideways, his deteriorating reflexes still quick enough to spoil the man's aim. The bullet meant for Jesse's chest carved a burning line across Dutch's shoulder instead, spinning him into the truck's tailgate. Jesse rolled behind the vehicle's bulk, his own weapon tracking targets. "How many more?" he called out. Dutch pressed his back against the cold metal, feeling his heart rate skyrocket as his chemically regulated cardiovascular system began to fail. "Doesn't matter," he wheezed. "Heinrich, he's not the top. Never was." Heinrich had collapsed to his knees, clutching his throat, but his eyes still held that terrible professional satisfaction. "Stockholm," he gasped. "The real program runs deeper than you know. Coaches, officials, entire Olympic committees." Another coughing fit doubled him over. "Tommy's already on their list. Kill me, and they'll just send someone else." The church bells chimed 10:30, each peal driving spikes of agony through Dutch's skull as his enhanced hearing sensitivity collapsed into ordinary human limitation. But with the pain came clarity, not chemical clarity, but the kind that came from finally understanding the true shape of a trap that had been years in the making. "Jesse," Dutch called out, his voice growing weaker. "The photographs. Look at the dates." Jesse glanced at the scattered documents while keeping his weapon trained on the remaining officers. His face went white. These go back to 1933, before you ever met Heinrich. They were watching me first, Dutch realized, each word an effort, as his optimized lung capacity diminished. The coaching position, the international assignments, all of it was designed to put me in position. He looked at Heinrich's crumpled form. You didn't recruit me. You manufactured me. Heinrich's bloody smile held no remorse. Your psychological profile, perfect for long-term unwitting cooperation. Divorced father desperate to prove his worth, aging athlete clinging to relevance. His breathing was becoming labored, but his voice remained steady. We knew exactly which buttons to push. Dutch felt something fundamental shift inside him. Not the chemical enhancement fading, but something deeper. The shame that had driven him for 3 years. The desperate need to prove himself worthy of Tommy's respect. All of it suddenly revealed as artificial manipulation. They hadn't just changed his body, they'd weaponized his love for his son. The ring, he said, looking at the device that had nearly made him Heinrich's assassin. You gave it to me hoping I'd use it. On Jesse, ideally. One enhanced American killing another would have provided perfect cover for expanding the program. Heinrich's eyes were losing focus, but his satisfaction remained intact. Your failure tonight merely delays the inevitable. Jesse emerged from cover, his weapon trained on the surviving officers who seemed more interested in fleeing than fighting. We need to get you to a hospital, he said to Dutch. But Dutch shook his head, understanding with terrible clarity that his enhanced body was already too far into chemical withdrawal to survive medical intervention. The supplements that had sustained him were killing him in their absence, just as Heinrich had designed them to. Tommy, Dutch whispered, his vision darkening at the edges. Find him first. The real supplements. In my coaching bag, not theirs. Heinrich's laughter turned into a death rattle, but his final words carried across the cobblestones with devastating precision. Too late. The boy's already chosen his path. Dutch's last coherent thought was that Heinrich was wrong about one thing. Tommy still had a choice to make. The question was whether anyone would be left alive to help him make it. The first sound Dutch became aware of was crying. Not his own, but close enough to feel like his breath. His eyes opened to white ceiling tiles and the antiseptic smell of a hospital room, though his last memory was of cobblestones and Heinrich's death rattle echoing off church walls. Grandfather? Tommy's voice cracked on the word, and Dutch turned his head to see his grandson sitting beside the bed, looking smaller than his 14 years. The boy's face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed from tears that Dutch realized had been falling for some time. How long? Dutch's voice came out as gravel, his throat raw from tubes he couldn't remember. 4 days, Jesse answered from the corner of the room. He looked older somehow, wearing civilian clothes instead of the formal attire Dutch remembered from Berlin. Touch and go for the first 2. The doctors said your body was fighting itself, some kind of chemical withdrawal they'd never seen before. Memory crashed back in waves. The ring, Heinrich's poison, the terrible revelation about Tommy's supplements. Dutch tried to sit up, panic flooding his system, but Jesse moved quickly to his side. Easy, Jesse said. Tommy's clean. We got to him in time. The supplements were vitamins, regular vitamins. Tommy's voice was steady now, though his hands shook as he reached for Dutch's. Jesse found your coaching bag, like you said. Had them tested against what I'd been taking. They were the same thing, Grandfather. Heinrich was lying. Dutch closed his eyes, feeling relief and devastation in equal measure. Then why? Because dying men tell lies too, Jesse said quietly. Heinrich knew he was finished. Wanted to leave you with one last poison, the belief that you'd failed Tommy the same way you thought you'd failed me in 36. The room fell silent except for the steady beep of monitoring equipment. Dutch studied his grandson's face, seeing neither the artificial enhancement Heinrich had threatened nor the genetic optimization the man had claimed to desire. Just a frightened boy who'd spent 4 days thinking his grandfather might die. There's something else, Jesse continued. Ruth's been here every day. She wants to see you when you're ready. Dutch's daughter. The conversations they'd never had about her mother's death, about his failures as a father, about the distance he'd built between them over decades of guilt and shame. Is she angry? Terrified? Relieved? Jessie's smile held no judgment. Yes to all of it, but mostly she's proud. Tommy told her what you did in Berlin, what you've been carrying all these years. What I've been carrying was a lie, Dutch said, the words tasting like medicine, bitter but necessary. I wasn't a hero in 36, Jessie. I was a coward who ran. You were 21 years old and in over your head, Jessie replied firmly. And what you did last week, that took more courage than anything a 21-year-old could have managed. Tommy squeezed Dutch's hand. The police came by yesterday. They said the investigation in Berlin uncovered a whole network, coaches, officials, even some Olympic Committee members. Your information helped them make arrests in 6 different countries. Dutch thought about Heinrich's final words, about the program running deeper than he'd known, about Stockholm and the corruption that had spread through international athletics like cancer. It's not over, no, Jessie agreed, but it's damaged, and there are good people working to finish what we started. The hospital room felt both too small and too vast, contained enough to be safe, but large enough to hold the weight of 47 years of guilt finally beginning to lift. Dutch looked at his hands, noting how they trembled without chemical enhancement, how age spots marked skin that was finally, completely his own again. I need to tell you about your grandmother, Dutch said to Tommy. The real story this time, about how she died and why I couldn't face being your father's father after that. Tommy nodded, settling back in his chair with the patience of someone who'd learned that some truths took time to surface. Jessie moved toward the door. I'll give you 2 some time. But Dutch? He paused with his hand on the handle. For what it's worth, I never needed you to be perfect. I just needed you to care enough to try. After Jessie left, Dutch began talking about Margaret's death in childbirth, about his son growing up with relatives while Dutch chased athletic glory across Europe, about the coaching positions that had seemed like redemption but were really just new ways to run from responsibility. Tommy listened without interruption, his young face serious but not judgmental. When Dutch finished, the room settled into the kind of quiet that felt like forgiveness, not dramatic or complete, but genuine enough to build on. The running stops now, Dutch said finally. Tommy smiled, the first real smile Dutch had seen from him since waking up. Good, the boy said. I was getting tired of trying to keep up. Outside the hospital window, ordinary people moved through their ordinary lives, carrying ordinary burdens that were nevertheless their own. It looked, Dutch thought, like exactly the kind of life worth staying for.